January 17, 1940, Berlin. The winter cold pressed against the tall windows of the Reich Main Security Office as Colonel Werner von Haeften unfolded a leather portfolio across the mahogany table. Steam rose from untouched coffee. Outside, snow fell in silence over the Wilhelmstrasse, muffling the city in white. Inside, the room smelled of tobacco, ink, and something else, something unspoken. Von Haeften's fingers trembled slightly as he smoothed the pages flat. Not from cold, not from age, from what the numbers revealed. The document before him was stamped Geheim, secret. It bore the seal of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, and it had arrived that morning via diplomatic pouch from Washington. 34 pages, charts, production figures, industrial capacity assessments, the kind of intelligence that could shift the calculus of nations. Von Haeften had spent 2 decades analyzing enemy capabilities, French fortifications, Polish mobilization rates, British naval deployments. He prided himself on precision, on the cold mathematics of war. But this report, compiled over 18 months by agents operating inside the United States, defied every assumption he had carried into that room. The headline figure sat at the top of page 7, circled in red ink by someone higher up the chain. American ammunition production capacity, when operating at wartime levels, would exceed Japanese output by a factor of 151 to 1. 151. Von Haeften read it 3 times. He checked the methodology. He cross-referenced the steel production tables, the chemical plant inventories, the railway freight data. The math held. And in that moment, sitting in a Berlin office while Europe burned and the Reich stood triumphant over Poland, Werner von Haeften understood something his superiors did not yet grasp. Germany was preparing to fight a nation that could not be defeated by courage alone. To understand the weight of that January morning, one must first understand what Germany believed about America in 1940. The prevailing view, shaped by both propaganda and genuine intelligence assessments, painted the United States as a nation of contradictions. Wealthy but soft, industrially advanced but politically chaotic, vast in resources but lacking the warrior spirit that had forged the Third Reich. This was not mere prejudice. It was doctrinal. German military theorists had studied the American Civil War, the Spanish-American conflict, the tentative entry into the Great War. They noted the reluctance, the isolationist sentiment, the way American society seemed to prioritize commerce over conquest. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel had famously dismissed American military potential in a 1939 briefing, calling the United States a nation of shopkeepers playing at soldiers. The phrase echoed Napoleon's old insult against Britain, but Keitel meant it literally. He pointed to America's small standing army, barely 190,000 men in 1939, smaller than Romania's, and its outdated equipment. He noted the political divisions, the labor strikes in defense plants, the America First movement that commanded millions of followers. And there was some truth to this assessment. America in 1940 was not a martial state. Its military budget ranked 17th in the world. Its tank designs lagged behind Germany's by nearly a decade. The Army conducted training exercises with wooden rifles and trucks painted with the word tank, because actual equipment didn't exist in sufficient numbers. Isolationist sentiment ran deep. The horrors of the Great War remained vivid in American memory. 116,000 dead. For what? So Europe could stumble into another war 20 years later. But the intelligence report on von Haeften's desk told a different story. It spoke not of soldiers or strategy, but of something more fundamental. Capacity. The raw, terrifying capacity of American industry operating at full throttle. The document's authors had divided American ammunition production into categories: small arms cartridges, artillery shells, aerial bombs, naval ordnance, and explosives manufacture. Each section built upon the last, layer by layer, constructing a portrait of industrial might that existed nowhere else on Earth. Begin with steel. By 1939, the United States produced more steel than Germany, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union combined. 61 million tons annually, with surge capacity to reach 90 million. German intelligence had tracked every major mill. The vast complexes of Pittsburgh, the lakefront plants of Gary, Indiana, the inland facilities being constructed in Colorado and Utah. Unlike European industries concentrated in vulnerable urban centers, American production sprawled across a continent protected by two oceans. The report noted, with clinical detachment, that no bomber in German inventory could reach these factories and return safely. Then came explosives. The United States had pioneered industrial chemistry. DuPont, Hercules Powder Company, Atlas Powder, Trojan U.S. Powder. These corporations had spent decades refining the manufacture of TNT, dynamite, smokeless powder, and newer compounds like RDX. The Abwehr estimated that American plants could produce, within 18 months of mobilization, more than 7 million pounds of military explosives per day. Japan, by comparison, struggled to manufacture 46,000 pounds daily, even after years of wartime production. 7 million versus 46,000. 151 to 1. The colonel traced his finger down a column listing ammunition plants. Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia, Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri, Radford Ordnance Works in Virginia, Denver Ordnance Plant in Colorado. These were not future projects. They were existing facilities, many operating below capacity in early 1940, waiting. The report included floor plans for some, production, schedules for others, shipping manifests, labor force assessments. American workers, it noted, were exceptionally productive, more so than their German or Japanese counterparts, due to mechanization, standardized processes, and a culture that rewarded efficiency. One facility alone, the Lake City plant, could theoretically produce 6 million small arms cartridges per day. Per day. The entire Japanese ammunition industry struggled to reach 40 million cartridges per month. Von Haeften set down the page and looked out the window. Snow continued to fall. Somewhere in the building, a typewriter clattered. Someone laughed. The sounds felt distant, irrelevant. He returned to the document. What German intelligence had discovered, and what von Haeften now confronted, was not merely a question of existing production. It was the American system itself, the invisible infrastructure of mass manufacturing that Henry Ford had pioneered in Detroit, and that had spread like a gospel across American industry. The report devoted 8 pages to what it called American Mass Production Doctrine. This was not simply about making more of something, it was a philosophical approach to manufacturing that treated interchangeability, standardization, and continuous flow as sacred principles. A rifle part made in Massachusetts fit perfectly with a receiver manufactured in Texas. A shell casing from Tennessee could be mated with a projectile from Illinois without any hand fitting or adjustment. This seemed simple, even obvious, but in 1940 it was revolutionary. German weapons manufacture, for all its precision and quality, remained rooted in craftsmanship traditions. Skilled workers hand-fitted components. Tolerances varied between factories. Parts were not truly interchangeable without adjustment. This produced excellent weapons, but slowly and in limited numbers. The Japanese system carried similar limitations, further constrained by resource scarcity and less developed industrial infrastructure. America had abandoned this approach 30 years earlier. The Ford Model T production line, which at its peak in the 1920s produced a complete automobile every 24 seconds, had demonstrated what happened when craft tradition yielded to engineering system. Skill moved from the worker's hands to the machine's design. Complexity became simple through subdivision of labor. Speed emerged from standardization. By 1940, this philosophy had infiltrated every corner of American manufacturing. The report described a visit by a German agent to the Winchester Repeating Arms Factory in New Haven, Connecticut. He watched 30 ASO-6 cartridges roll off the line at a rate of 1,500 per minute, with quality control checks automated by machinery that rejected defective rounds without human intervention. The entire process, from raw brass to finished cartridge, occurred under one roof in less than an hour. The factory could operate 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly, with workers changing shifts while machines ran continuously. The agent had tried to count the cartridges piling into wooden crates. He gave up. The numbers lost meaning. He reported feeling, for the first time, what he called industrial vertigo, the disorienting sense of abundance that characterized American manufacturing. Colonel von Haeften understood weapons. He understood tactics, logistics, operational planning. But this report forced him to confront something that German military education had not prepared him for: the weaponization of abundance itself. Germany fought wars the way Europeans had for centuries, through the efficient allocation of scarce resources, the careful husbanding of materiel, the precise calculation of supply against demand. Ammunition was valuable. It was accounted for, rationed, distributed according to doctrine. A German infantryman received a specific allotment of cartridges. An artillery battery fired a designated number of shells per engagement, carefully calculated to achieve objectives without waste. This was sound military practice, refined over generations of warfare. The intelligence report suggested that America would fight differently, not through efficiency and conservation, but through overwhelming surplus, through an approach that treated ammunition not as precious, but as disposable, even casual. The implications staggered him. Consider a single infantry division in sustained combat. German doctrine allocated approximately 1.5 million rifle and machine gun cartridges per month for a division at full operational tempo. This was generous by European standards. It assumed aggressive operations, heavy contact, modern automatic weapons. German industry could support this allocation for perhaps 30 divisions simultaneously, while also supplying the Luftwaffe, the Kriegsmarine, and Allied forces. American capacity, according to the report, could supply similar ammunition levels to more than 450 divisions. 450. The United States didn't have 450 divisions. It barely had one proper armored division in 1940, but the capacity existed. The factories stood ready. The machinery waited, greased, and maintained for orders that would come. And this was only small arms ammunition. The disparity grew more pronounced with heavier ordnance. Artillery consumed shells voraciously. A single German 105mm howitzer battery, 6 guns, firing at normal combat rates used approximately 2,000 shells per week. Maintaining 300 such batteries required 600,000 shells weekly, or 2.4 million monthly. German industry in 1940 could sustain this level for perhaps 400 batteries across all fronts while maintaining reserves. American capacity, when fully mobilized, could support 15,000 batteries. 15,000. It could bury entire army groups under steel. It could make artillery ammunition so abundant that field commanders would face not scarcity but the logistical challenge of managing surplus. Von Haeften found a section detailing a procurement competition held by the U.S. Army in 1939 for 75mm artillery shells. 7 companies had submitted bids. 7 separate corporations, each capable of producing millions of shells, competing for the contract. The winner, a firm called American Can Company, primarily known for manufacturing food containers, promised delivery of 12 million shells within 18 months, with surge capacity to double that figure. A food Can manufacture was going to produce 12 million artillery shells. The colonel almost laughed. It was absurd. It was terrifying. It was very, very American. But raw numbers told only part of the story. The report's most chilling section addressed what German intelligence called cultural factors in American production capacity. This was softer analysis, more speculative, but it cut deeper than the statistics. American workers, the report noted, were different. Not better or worse in individual skill, German craftsmen remained unmatched in precision work, but different in their relationship to production itself. Americans exhibited what one agent called industrial optimism, a cultural belief that any problem could be solved through better processes, more efficient machinery, smarter organization. Where European workers viewed manufacturing constraints as fixed, this is how much we can make, these are our limits, Americans treated constraints as temporary challenges to be engineered away. The report included interviews with German engineers who had toured American factories in the late 1930s before tensions escalated. They described a culture of continuous improvement that bordered on obsession. Production line workers submitted suggestions for efficiency gains and received bonuses for implemented ideas. Floor managers competed to reduce cycle times, cut waste, increase throughput. Everyone from the company president to the janitor seemed personally invested in making more, faster, better. One engineer recounted visiting the Willow Run bomber plant under construction in Michigan. When asked about target production rates, the Ford Motor Company executive leading the tour had said, without irony, that they intended to produce one B-24 Liberator bomber per hour once the plant reached full capacity. One 4-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes. The German engineer had assumed this was propaganda, American bravado. But the plant's specifications, the size, the machinery, the workforce plans, suggested the target was genuine. The Americans actually believed they could manufacture heavy bombers at automotive production rates, and they were probably right. This was the cultural gulf that no intelligence report could fully bridge. Germany had built its war machine through state direction, through the subordination of civilian production to military needs, through the iron discipline of a command economy. It was impressive. It was efficient. It had produced the Wehrmacht that now dominated Europe. But America's system was different. It was chaotic, competitive, profit-driven, and weirdly voluntary. Companies fought for military contracts not because they were ordered to, but because contracts meant profit. Workers took overtime shifts not because the state demanded it, but because overtime paid better. Engineers designed better production methods not to serve the Führer, but to outcompete the factory across town. The whole apparatus ran on incentives and competition rather than commands and obedience. It shouldn't work. It violated everything German military theory understood about mobilization, and yet the numbers suggested it worked terrifyingly well. Colonel von Haeften reached the report's final section, comparative analysis with Japanese ammunition production. This was where the 151-to-1 ratio appeared, stark and undeniable. Japan in 1940 was a military power. It had conquered vast territories in China, built a formidable navy, and demonstrated tactical excellence in numerous campaigns. But its industrial base remained constrained by geography, resources, and development. The home islands lacked iron ore, lacked petroleum, lacked rubber, lacked the vast coal fields that powered American and German industry. Everything had to be imported, transported across vulnerable sea lanes, rationed carefully among competing needs. Japanese ammunition production reflected these constraints. The report estimated total Japanese capacity at approximately 15 million rifle cartridges per month. Decent output for a nation at war, but a fraction of potential American production. Japanese artillery shell manufacturers struggled with quality control issues. Duds rates sometimes exceeded 15%. Explosives production depended heavily on imported materials, creating dangerous vulnerabilities. The comparison table occupied a full page. Rifle cartridges, USA 2,270 million per month potential, Japan 15 million per month actual. Artillery shells, USA 48 million per month potential, Japan 380,000 per month actual. Aerial bombs, USA 1.8 million per month potential, Japan 24,000 per month actual. Line after line, the ratios held, 151 to 1, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, but always catastrophic. And Japan knew. The report included references to Japanese intelligence assessments of American capability. Japanese observers had reached similar conclusions, perhaps even more pessimistic ones. Yet Japan continued its expansion, continued its aggression, continued moving toward confrontation with a nation that could literally drown it in ammunition. Why? Von Haeften found a partial answer in a footnote. A Japanese colonel, speaking at a military conference in Tokyo, had reportedly said, "We cannot match American production. We can only hope they lack the will to use it." The strategy, if one could call it that, rested on the belief that American democracy would fracture under pressure, that isolationist sentiment would prevent mobilization, that a quick, devastating strike might force a negotiated peace before the industrial giant fully awoke. It was a bet on American weakness, a wager that abundance and comfort had made Americans unwilling to fight, unable to endure hardship, ready to compromise rather than commit to total war. The colonel had studied enough American history to doubt this assumption. But even if it were true, even if American will proved brittle, the industrial capacity remained. The factories existed. The machinery waited. The knowledge and systems and infrastructure sat ready for activation. And once activated, the report made clear, nothing Japan possessed could stop it. Outside, the Berlin snow fell heavier now, coating the city in white. Inside the office, von Haeften closed the leather portfolio and sat in silence. The coffee had gone cold. The room felt colder, though the radiator hissed with heat. He thought about steel, about explosives, about assembly lines running day and night, about rivers of brass cartridges cascading into crates, about warehouses stacked to the ceiling with shells that would never be fired because more shells kept arriving faster than any army could expend them. He thought about American workers clocking in for the night shift at the Lake City plant, about Ford engineers calculating production line speeds at Willow Run, about procurement officers in Washington placing orders that casual so enormous that European minds struggled to process them. And he thought about German soldiers, boys, really, 18 and 19 years old, who would someday face the output of those factories, who would crouch in foxholes while American artillery transformed the world above them into shrieking chaos, who would advance across fields where spent cartridge cases lay so thick they crunched underfoot like gravel, who would discover, too late, that courage and training and tactical excellence meant little when the enemy possessed effectively unlimited ammunition. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in 35 days. It would soon conquer France in 6 weeks. It would tear through Yugoslavia in 11 days. Greece in 24. German soldiers believed themselves invincible, and they had earned that belief through victory after victory. They had never encountered an enemy that could afford to be wasteful, that could saturate entire grid squares with fire simply because ammunition was abundant enough to make precision unnecessary. They expected war as Europeans understood it, calculated, economical, resolved through maneuver and decisive battle. They would instead face something alien, industrial warfare at American scale, where the only limit was how fast ammunition could be delivered to the guns. The transformation in German thinking happened slowly, then all at once. Von Haeften's report circulated among Abwehr leadership, then made its way to OKW, the Wehrmacht High Command. Some officers dismissed it as exaggerated, others noted it but failed to grasp its implications. A few, like von Haeften, understood immediately what it meant. But understanding didn't equal acceptance. The Wehrmacht was triumphant in 1940, master of Europe, apparently unstoppable. The idea that a distant, unwarlike nation of shopkeepers posed an existential threat seemed absurd, almost insulting. Germany's enemies were here now, Britain across the Channel, the Soviet Union to the east. America was an ocean away, neutral, divided, irrelevant to Germany's immediate concerns. And yet the numbers lingered in von Haeften's mind. 151 to 1. He found himself returning to the calculation, checking his arithmetic, looking for errors that weren't there. He tried to imagine what 151 times more ammunition actually meant in practical terms. If Japanese artillery fired 10,000 shells in a major offensive, American artillery could fire 1,410,000 shells in response. If Japan expended its monthly production of bombs, America could expend its weekly production and still have reserves. The math became nightmarish at scale. It suggested battles that weren't battles at all, but systematic annihilation. It suggested campaigns where logistics ceased to constrain operations because supply exceeded any possible demand. It suggested, ultimately, and that fighting America meant fighting an enemy that could afford infinite mistakes, infinite losses, infinite expenditure, because the ammunition would never run out. One detail from the report haunted him particularly. An American ordnance officer, interviewed unwittingly by a German agent posing as a journalist, had discussed ammunition supply doctrine. The officer explained that American planning called for maintaining stockpiles equal to 90 days of maximum consumption at all times, with production capacity exceeding peacetime requirements by at least 300%. This wasn't just abundance, it was abundance as doctrine, built into the very structure of military planning. The officer had laughed when asked about ammunition shortages, as if the concept was inherently absurd. "We're Americans," he'd said. "We don't run out of things." That casualness, that unthinking confidence in perpetual surplus, was perhaps more revealing than any production figure. It spoke to a nation that had never experienced genuine scarcity, never faced resource constraints that couldn't be overcome through innovation and expansion. It was the mindset of a continental power with vast natural resources, technological sophistication, and a population trained to believe that every problem had a solution if you just manufactured enough of something. Years later, after the war, von Haeften, if he survived, records are unclear, would have seen his January 1940 assessment validated in blood and steel. He would have learned how American ammunition production didn't just meet the report's projections, but exceeded them. How the Lake City plant alone produced more than 47 billion rounds during the war. How American artillery in Europe sometimes fired 5,000 shells per minute during major bombardments, not because precision demanded it, but because the shells were available. How American industry supplied not just U.S. forces, but armed Britain, equipped the Soviet Union, provisioned China, and still maintained surplus. The Soviets received 1.5 billion rifle cartridges from American production. Britain received millions of artillery shells. Even French forces rebuilt after liberation received American ammunition because France's own industry couldn't keep pace. The numbers from that leather portfolio came to life as global reality. And he would have learned what happened to Japanese soldiers who faced this abundance. Marines at Tarawa reported finding Japanese defenders with less than 30 rounds per man, rationed, conserved, stretched across days of battle. American troops came ashore with 100 rounds per rifle, plus grenades, plus naval gunfire support, plus aerial bombardment, plus artillery once the beachhead expanded. The Americans could afford to saturate bunkers with fire. They could afford to use ammunition liberally, even wastefully, because resupply ships waited offshore with millions more rounds. Japanese troops spoke of American rain, the constant, drumming impact of bullets and shells that seemed to never stop, never slow, never reach a supply limit that might offer respite. They had trained for battle. They found themselves facing industrial annihilation instead. German soldiers on the Western Front after 1944 experienced similar revelations. The Ardennes offensive failed partly because German forces couldn't sustain ammunition supply, while American forces could pull from stockpiles that seemed bottomless. American units radioed for fire support and received it within minutes. Not carefully calculated rounds, but entire fire missions dumping hundreds of shells onto target coordinates simply to guarantee destruction. American doctrine didn't require precision when abundance made saturation achievable. The 151-to-1 ratio manifested as bodies in the snow, as forests splintered into matchsticks, as cities transformed into rubble. It became real, tangible, undeniable. But there's a deeper story beneath the statistics, beneath the production figures and the kill ratios and the mountains of expended brass. It's the story of what ammunition represents, not as a weapon, but as a philosophy. Every artillery shell carries within it a set of assumptions about the world. It assumes industrial capacity, assumes resource availability, assumes transportation networks, assumes technical knowledge, assumes social organization sufficient to transform raw ore into finished ordnance. It assumes surplus. And in assuming surplus, it reveals a society's fundamental relationship with scarcity. European and Japanese military traditions developed in worlds defined by scarcity. Land was limited. Resources were constrained. Populations were finite. Military doctrine reflected these realities. Careful, economical, always aware that waste today meant shortage tomorrow. Ammunition was valuable because everything was valuable. Conservation was virtue. American military tradition developed in a different world. A continental nation with vast resources, expanding frontiers, and a culture that treated growth as normal and limits as temporary. American doctrine didn't internalize scarcity because American experience didn't validate it. The nation's entire history was one of overcoming constraints through production, through innovation, through making more. This wasn't better or worse. It was different. It made Americans strange, wasteful by European standards, casual about things that should be precious, weirdly confident that problems could be solved through sheer volume of effort. And when this culture built a war machine, it built one that reflected these values. Not elegant efficiency, but overwhelming abundance. Not careful allocation, but surplus to the point of absurdity. Not conservation, but expenditure as strategy. The ammunition production disparity wasn't just about industrial capacity. It was about national character expressed in steel and explosives. It was America itself, transformed into 75mm shells stacked in ammunition dumps from Normandy to Manila. It was democracy's answer to tyranny. Not a better ideology, but more of everything. More production, more logistics, more supply, more waste, more surplus, more. Colonel von Haeften, sitting in his Berlin office in January 1940, couldn't have articulated all this. But he felt it. Felt the weight of those numbers as something more than statistics. He understood in some intuitive way that the leather portfolio contained not just an intelligence report, but a glimpse of the future. Germany would lose. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not inevitably, but ultimately, because no nation, however disciplined, however motivated, however tactically superior, could defeat an enemy that treated ammunition as effectively infinite. You couldn't outfight infinite ammunition, you couldn't outmaneuver it, couldn't outthink it. You could only survive it, and survival would require either victory before the ammunition arrived or surrender once it did. Japan would lose for the same reason, perhaps more completely. Its empire, vast as it was, rested on ships that could be sunk, supply lines that could be cut, resources that could be exhausted. And on the other side of the Pacific waited factories that never stopped, that never slowed, that turned out ammunition faster than any military force could possibly expend it. The snow fell outside. Inside, von Haeften placed the portfolio in his safe, spun the lock, and sat for a moment in the gathering dusk. Somewhere in America, in Missouri, in Pennsylvania, in Colorado, factory workers were changing shifts. Machines hummed. Ammunition rolled off the production lines into crates, into trucks, into warehouses. Waiting. The numbers told a story about the future, but they also told a story about the present, about a world dividing between nations of scarcity and a nation of abundance, between military forces that conserved ammunition and one that would soon overwhelm the world with it. The leather portfolio contained truth, but truth that his superiors were not yet ready to accept. There is a photograph taken sometime in 1945 of an American ammunition dump in France. It stretches to the horizon, wooden crates stacked in geometric precision, row after row after row, guarded by a handful of bored soldiers who look more like warehouse clerks than warriors. Each crate contains shells or cartridges or bombs, millions of rounds in total, more than an entire German division would expend in a year of combat. And this is just one dump, one location among hundreds scattered across Europe and the Pacific. The photograph circulated after the war as evidence of Allied logistical superiority, but it's also a memorial of sorts, a monument to the moment when warfare transformed from an art of scarcity into a science of abundance, when ammunition ceased being a limiting factor and became a strategy unto itself. The soldiers who faced this abundance, German and Japanese troops who fought knowing their bullets were numbered while the enemy's were not, developed a kind of fatalism. They fought bravely, often brilliantly, but beneath the courage lay the crushing knowledge that they were being outproduced, that somewhere far from the battlefield, in factories they would never see, workers who would never face combat were manufacturing the instruments of their defeat at rates their own industries could never match. This was the truth Colonel von Haeften discovered in January 1940. Not that America was stronger, it wasn't, not yet, but that it had the capacity to become unstoppable once mobilized. That the nation of shopkeepers possessed a form of power that military tradition hadn't adequately theorized. The power of industrial surplus weaponized. The ratio 151-1 became real as shrapnel tearing through flesh, as forests demolished by preparatory barrages, as ammunition dumps stretching to the horizon. It became real as American troops advancing with full pouches and ready magazines while their enemies searched dead comrades for spare rounds. It became real as naval guns firing until barrels wore smooth, then being replaced within hours, while Japanese ships rationed their last shells over days. It became real as the world learned what American abundance meant when applied to warfare. Not precision or elegance, but overwhelming, relentless, exhausting plenty. Steel rain that never stopped falling. Supply that never exhausted, the arithmetic of infinite ammunition made manifest. In the end, after the cities burned and the empires fell and the peace treaties were signed, that leather portfolio remained in archives, A prophecy fulfilled, a warning ignored, a document that captured the moment when someone finally calculated what America could do if it chose to fight. The colonel who read it in January 1940 understood something his nation's leadership didn't: that the coming war would be decided not on battlefields, but in factories, not by tactical genius but by production capacity, not by will or courage or sacrifice but by the cold mathematics of industrial output. He understood that ammunition, simple, mundane, taken for granted, would become the deciding factor, that the side which could afford to be wasteful would defeat the side forced to conserve, that abundance, that most American of virtues, would prove more powerful than discipline or honor or any of the martial values Germany and Japan prized. The numbers told this story: 151 times more explosives. Numbers so large they lost meaning until they transformed into reality, into ammunition dumps stretching across continents, into fire missions that expended more shells in an afternoon than entire divisions possessed, into a kind of warfare that wasn't warfare at all, but industrial demolition applied to human targets. And somewhere, in archives in Berlin and Tokyo and Washington, in museums and historical collections, that report still exists. The leather portfolio with its neat tables and damning calculations, its vision of futures both nations refused to believe until those futures arrived as fire and smoke and the drumming rain of American steel. The snow fell on Berlin in January 1940. The colonel closed his safe. The world turned toward war. And in Missouri and Pennsylvania and Colorado, the factories waited, quiet, patient, ready to produce more ammunition than the world had ever imagined possible. Ready to transform abundance into arsenal, industry into empire, production into power. Ready to prove that sometimes, in the calculus of war, more is enough.